Hey there, guys and gals. It's Dante Ferrigno coming back at you from Ferrigno Freedom Channel, a channel that's dedicated to getting healthy physically, mentally, and spiritually. I've been doing a carnivore way of eating called the Lion Diet now for about 3 years, and it has changed everything. Today, I'm coming back to review this, or to react to this video by Dr. Paul Mason called The Corrupt History of the Food Pyramid. Some of you may have heard of Dr. Paul Mason. He's a regular on the channel Low Carb Down Under. I'll put links for the video and for their channel in the description if you're not familiar with them. He is a really good doctor down in Australia that has a great presentation method. It's kind of a school room environment, but you know, his information is just amazing, and I want to check this one out. I started to watch it earlier, but I decided I'd wait and share it with you guys because I know it's going to be very important for a lot of you to be able to know this information and possibly even share this with people in your life who have been brainwashed by the information that we have been fed for the last 50 plus years with regard to the way we eat in this country. I know I, as a carnivore, get flack all the time from doctors, friends, family members, and I know a lot of you guys do too, because it can be really rough when you're trying to live your best life and you're hoping to see your friends and loved ones join you on this because you want them to be healthy and happy too, and it can be very hard to overcome what we've been preached to for the past 50 plus years. So this video might actually give you some great information that you could share with them. You could share my video, or you could even share the video directly. And if this video isn't enough, I did watch one yesterday that was made by I think it's called Evil Food Channel or something like that. I'll put a link for them in the description and for their video. It's a little bit more flashy presentation of a similar discussion that I found to be very interesting, and it might keep the attention of certain people a little bit better. But be sure to check that one out too. But without any further ado, oh, by the way, this is my carnivore friend Sam back here. He's taking a nap, waiting for something else to eat. But you say hi to Sam. Sam, say hi. Yeah, he's wide awake. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump right into this video. Oh, let me go ahead and put my headphones on. Something I often forget to do.
So, g'day. I'm Dr. Paul Mason. And you might think that what you're looking at here is a work of science. That back in the 1970s, scientists without vested interests methodically reviewed the science to determine the healthiest diet, and then presented this to the public. Unsurprisingly, this didn't actually happen. Most of us are acutely aware that science and politics shouldn't mix, and yet they're inseparable. The fact is, when we mix science with politics, we get politics. And the food pyramid is a product of politics. The backdrop to the story of the food pyramid begins in post-war 1950s America. Deaths from competing causes, namely war and infection, had drastically reduced. And at the same time, rates of smoking were increasing. As a result, heart disease rapidly became the leading cause of death. And on this backdrop, in 1955, President Dwight D. Eisenhower suffered a heart attack. He was out playing golf in Denver when he felt what he thought was an episode of indigestion from a hamburger. And later that night, he woke with severe chest pain. So his personal physician, not realising he was having a heart attack, gave him several shots of morphine and sent him back to sleep. It was only after an ECG was performed after he awoke at 1 p.m. the next afternoon that it was understood that he'd in fact had a heart attack. This was major news, which struck a nerve with the US population. The life of their leader, due for re-election, was on a knife's edge. With heart disease, the new leading cause of death, the American population was gripped by fear. So the hunt was on for the root cause of this deadly scourge. Unfortunately, scientists of the day didn't seem to pay too much attention to Eisenhower's heavy smoking, reported to be up to 4 packets a day. Indeed, this was in an age when doctors themselves promoted smoking. Rather, the scourge of heart disease was attributed to dietary saturated fat. And if you're a plumber, this might make sense. After all, pouring fat down a sink can block a drain.
I want to pause it right there just for a moment, because I do want to say that when I heard this part of his speech earlier, I had a hard time hearing the cigarette smoking being the cause of heart disease, only because, and I'm not saying cigarette smoking is not bad for you. Obviously, cigarette smoking is bad for you. I remember dealing with residents at the retirement home that I used to be the administrator of, and people who had smoked most of their lives usually had trouble breathing, emphysema, COPD, all kind of problems. I had one guy in there that only had a portion of his lung left, but he still longed to have those cigarettes. So clearly they have a negative side effect. But one of the things he didn't mention here, at least he didn't mention in the early part, I haven't watched the whole thing, is that Eisenhower had quit smoking about 5 years before his heart attack. Now, granted, he probably did a lot of damage in smoking 4 packs a day up until that point, and that could very well be the case. But the research that I've done when it comes to Otto Warburg and his studies on cancer revealed that there was a lot more than meets the eye when it comes to diet. Now, clearly, Dr. Mason is going to get into diet as being a major issue for these heart problems, or at least I assume he would, or he wouldn't be talking about the food pyramid while he talks about this background. But I'm hoping to see that he's going to get into that, because one of the things that started to change in the American diet and in the European diet was a whole lot more sugar in the diet than there used to be. As a matter of fact, a lot of people couldn't even get their hands on sugar, and a lot of people were eating meat and dairy on a regular basis, and vegetables and things like that were very common for the people who couldn't afford to get their hands on meat or dairy. But for the most part, meat and dairy made up a huge portion of the American diet and a pretty good sized portion of the European diet. But as time progressed and we started to get our versions of processed food, and they started to introduce seed oils and things like Crisco, which was in the early 20th century that it came into play, and people started frying their food in that instead of using lard or other animal fats, that we started to see this big spike not only in heart disease but also in cancer. And Warburg's studies really revealed that cancer was a voracious eater of glucose, and that information got lost to us. There was a book written by Sam Apple called Otto Warburg and the Nazis, because he was a scientist in Germany during the reign of the Nazi Party. And because Otto Warburg was a Jewish person too, there was a lot of issues regarding his actions during that time period. But that doesn't change the fact that his science was pointing to glucose being a major problem for the cancer issue. I also believe it's a major problem for the overall heart issues that we were facing. But smoking may have very well have played a big role in the heart issues. I don't see how smoking has that relation, but once again, I'm just a guy on YouTube. I'm not a doctor, but I can certainly attest to the fact that quitting smoking, something that I've been able to do, especially while on a diet like this that has just been able to help me decide to get all the bad stuff out of my life, has been a wonderful benefit. But let's go ahead and continue on here and see what he's got to say.
The rest of us, however, realize that our physiology does not resemble that of a kitchen sink. Which begs the question, how on earth did these scientists in the 1950s come to the conclusion that saturated fat was the cause of heart disease? An ancient food consumed for millennia being blamed for a modern disease? Well, it can be traced back to research performed by this man, the Russian Nikolai Anikov. It was in 1913 that he published a paper which has more than 100 years later been described as the birth of the lipid hypothesis, the theory that saturated fat can clog the arteries. Nikolai had demonstrated that feeding rabbits, an obvious herbivore, lard, egg yolks, or pure cholesterol dissolved in sunflower oil led to increases in the rabbit's blood cholesterol levels. And over time, arterial lesions similar to, but not identical to, that of human heart disease developed. Now, there's a lot wrong with this. Rabbits shouldn't be eating lard any more than we should be eating grass. Nonetheless, this research planted the seed from which the diet heart hypothesis was born. And it was driven by this man, Ancel Keys, who was almost singularly responsible for growing that seed of poor research into the twisted mess of a food pyramid that we have. He was dogmatic, belligerent, and undeniably political. Three
100%.
qualities that he wielded bloody-mindedly to steamroll any dissenting views. And by that, I really mean any reasonable opposition to his outlandish claims. He repeatedly broke with the civil norms of academia to bully dissenting colleagues and almost brutally silence any opposition. And in the context of what was perceived to be a growing public emergency, being that of the unexplained cause of heart disease, health officials were receptive to his message. You see, 2 years before Eisenhower's heart attack, Ancel Keys had published a widely criticised graph plotting the average fat consumption in various countries against heart disease. The problem was that while he had plotted the data from 6 countries to make his point, the study's critics pointed out that at the time, data was actually available for 22 countries. And when the data from those 22 countries was plotted, as it was in this scientific rebuttal, it resembled more of a scatterplot. That, of course, should have been the last we've heard of Keys' theory. Inexplicably, however, he was able to establish significant influence within the American Heart Association.
I wouldn't call it inexplicable because he was extremely bullying in his tactics, as Dr. Mason mentioned. And he was in a position where he had already been recognized as an expert in this area. Now, this is something we see a lot of today, where people who claim to be the experts, the science themselves, that say things that turn out to be not scientific. Well, once they've said these things, once they've got their foot in the door on these things, the problem seems to be is they can't back down from those issues because then they look like fools and they lose their position. They have to stick dogmatically to what they said to begin with. Otherwise, they lose their credibility. And somehow today, people can say things that are completely uncredible, and yet they continue to be in positions of authority when it comes to making decisions for us. And it's very frustrating, but hopefully he's going to get into the fact that the AHA was also being funded tremendously by companies that make vegetable oils. And there was definitely a conflict of interest there. As a matter of fact, the wheat and grain industry got heavily involved into this. But I digress because I want to let Paul Mason explain what he knows about it, and we'll see what matches what I've learned, and hopefully you guys will learn something too.
And by 1958, the American Heart Association, with Keys now at the helm, launched the 7-country study. Not surprisingly, he anchored the results with 3 countries from his 6 countries graph, perhaps foretelling the findings before it was eventually published in 1978. It's also pertinent to point out that at the time, the American Heart Association was sponsored by Procter & Gamble, makers of the extremely profitable vegetable oil shortening Crisco. And on the back of his political manoeuvring, Ancel Keys' star continued to rise. In 1961, he fronted the cover of Time magazine, in which his views featured prominently in an article vilifying saturated fat and going so far as to claim that smoking played little role in heart disease. Ironically,
I would say this is not the first time that the mainstream media has been responsible for trumpeting information that is absolutely not true because they want to be the first ones to get the information out there. And, you know, there's a lot of people that say that there's other ulterior motives that might have been behind this. I don't see anything directly when it comes to these early periods other than the profit motive that was involved and a researcher getting support financially for what he wants to do and for his career. But later on, there might be some questions that arise in that area that where certain people in positions of power, let's just say, were able to take a look at what this type of food was doing to us and to continue to not only promote the eating of the food that's been such a problem, but to ramp it up to a level that's never been seen before.
It's documented that by 1968, Key's own 7 countries study indicated that cardiovascular disease was actually associated and probably caused by smoking, although this competing information was not disclosed to the public until 1980, well after the horse had bolted.
I hadn't heard about that.
Still, the 7-country study didn't necessarily have to be the final word on the topic. In fact, we know epidemiological research, like the 7-country study, is quite weak in terms of proving causality. Rather, experimental studies, which can control for confounders, provide for much stronger findings. The best quality being what we call randomised control trials. And before the publication of the 7-country study in 1978, a large randomised control trial investigating the effects of reducing saturated fat was underway. Known as the Minnesota Coronary Survey, this study involved more than 9,000 participants and was investigating the effect of reducing saturated fat on heart disease. And Keyes, in fact, was a co-principal investigator, one of 2 co-principal investigators to this study, presumably hoping that it would build his case for the elimination of saturated fats to those pesky scientists who insisted on asking for credible evidence. The nerve.
This all
what he was
sounds
not
familiar.
counting on, however, was that the results of this study, the Minnesota Coronary Survey, did not go to plan. They didn't find saturated fat to be harmful, which perhaps explains why the first results weren't published until 1989. Despite the study concluding in 1978. The finding being that replacing animal source saturated fats with vegetable oil did not reduce the risk of heart disease. And for reasons that have never been explained, yet which seem rather obvious, Key's name was absent from the eventual publication, despite him being one of 2 principal co-investigators. The other principal co-investigator, Ivan France, the lead author on the eventual paper, was interviewed by science journalist Gary Taubes before his death. When asked why they delayed publication of the results by 16 years, he replied, "We were just so disappointed in the way they turned out." Clearly, this basically amounts to a cover-up, the hiding of unpalatable results. Conduct that is not becoming of any true science.
You know, that's something as a YouTuber talking about my experience on a diet like this that I have to battle with sometimes when things don't go as well as I thought, whether it comes with exercising or fasting or anything that I'm doing to see, maybe try bringing food back in that I thought would be something that I might be able to eat now because of the healing that my body has gone through. But I find that I can't proceed. I mean, there's a desire to hide the facts that you don't want to be presented because it's going to be perceived as negative. And when you're reading your comments and you got people saying negative things, or you got people that are vegans that jump on board and they want to find anything that they can nitpick. And the point is it's very easy for human nature to do exactly what he's talking about, especially when your career's on the line, when your provision for your family's on the line, when your name is on the line, and especially if you have a tremendous amount of pride, it can definitely be something that would overwhelm. And typically somebody who's extremely dogmatic like that has a certain arrogance about them that they don't want anybody questioning or challenging them. Well, I can tell you that I make those sacrifices to go ahead and present the things that I'm not happy about, or even the actions that I take that flaw my own test, like failing to eat properly on Thanksgiving. Not that I'm worried about that anymore, but it's something that it was like once I did it, I thought, geez, now I got to tell my audience that I didn't even stick to what I said I would do. And then there's going to be some vegan influencer out there that's going to make another video that says, oh, look, see, he couldn't even avoid sugar. This just goes to show his body's craving sugar. He needs this sugar. He needs this fruit. He needs this whatever it is. But you know what? The truth always wins in the long run. And if you stick with the truth will set you free. And that's been my experience. And I learned this from Jordan Peterson as well as my study of the scriptures. But Jordan Peterson talks about the adventure that you live when you simply live the truth as close to it as you can. You know, we all have a tendency to obfuscate things that we don't want people to see. But I have found the adventure really comes when you speak the truth as close to the way you know it, because we don't always know what the truth is. But as long as you're sticking with what you know the truth to be, and you're challenging your own suppositions, your presuppositions, your conclusions that you've made, when you're attacking your own beliefs so that you can make sure that you're solid in what you believe and that you're not just believing something that isn't true, then you wind up being able to present something that is helpful for the world. Well, what we've got here with this mixture of politics and agribusiness, which he didn't even talk about, I don't know if he's going to talk about, the Secretary of Agriculture at the time of the Nixon administration, when they brought this stuff in the late 70s, or the early 70s rather, I think his name was Earl Butz, B-U-T-Z, how he basically was able to unseat the family farmer from the table and bring in all the agribusiness people to be able to use subsidization of crops and things that would be free money, basically handouts, another way the government takes a lot of advantage of things, and then takes it in a whole different direction for political purposes. And then they get their gain out of it, the farmers get their gain out of it, the American people get fed a whole bunch of lies and wind up having to pay more for things that they shouldn't be paying more for. It's one of those things that really gets under my skin, but it's something that we all have to deal with. But we've got to use our mind and be able to critically think when we see these things and we see presentation of the truth like this that counters what was told to us that was clearly obscuring the truth. We have to be able to make a change in the way we think. And that's hard because we have been taught, especially people in my generation or older, who have listened to all of this information about food. Don't eat red meat. Don't eat salt. Eat the egg whites and not the egg yolks. Eat salads and low-fat dieting. All of the things that I did for many years that led me to be in the worst health of my life. As soon as I found out that there was a different way, that there was information that countered what they were saying, and I applied those principles to my life, it has literally changed everything. If you saw the opening clip of me standing side by side with myself at the beginning of this diet and myself at the beginning of this year, which, like I said, it's been about 3 years, so that was 2 years into eating this way, I'm a whole different person. And it's all because I was able to challenge what I had been told and listen to something that was presenting a different side of the story. So hopefully anybody you share this with will be able to use their reasoning brain and come to a conclusion that's going to help them with their health, with their mental health, and believe it or not, it has even helped spiritually because it's allowed me to be able to control my flesh in a way that I never thought that I would have the ability to do, because that was my big downfall, was giving into the fleshly desires, whether it was eating or other things. This way of eating has helped me to just ratchet down my life into a way that I'm living the life that I always wanted to live. And it's a big part of following the truth.
As Richard Feynman, famous physicist, said, it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is. It doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with the experiment, it's wrong. Have no doubt that honesty and transparency of these results would have seen the food pyramid dispatched before it ever existed, before it was hoisted up onto an unsuspecting public. Of course, even the 1989 publication somewhat distorted the truth by omission. You see, the 1989 publication provided very limited, almost selective data which precluded a proper analysis, only allowing the conclusion to be drawn that saturated fat didn't appear to be harmful. And this man, Dr. Christopher Ramsden, is a central figure in the full truth finally coming to light. Following up on the earlier investigation by Gary Taubes, Dr. Ramsden contacted the then deceased Ivan France, the lead author's son, Robert. And Robert, after searching through the basement of his childhood home, uncovered 2 ancient magnetic computer tapes containing almost 60,000 records. After an exhaustive process of translation to modern computer language and validation of the data, the full results were finally published in 2016 in the prestigious British Medical Journal, some 38 years after the study was completed. The ultimate conclusion being that while replacing saturated fat with vegetable oil did indeed lower cholesterol levels, it did so at the cost of an increased risk of death. In other words, subjects who consumed less saturated fat and more seed oil were more likely to die. It simply wouldn't have been possible for the food pyramid to be released had this data been available in 1978. But while the Minnesota Coronary study was still underway, Ansel Keys continued to promote his pet theory. And in 1977, with the US still gripped with fear of heart disease, Senator McGovern convened a select committee meeting on nutrition. And despite the lack of credible evidence, the select committee released a set of nutritional goals which vilified saturated fat. This was, of course, in keeping with Keys' pet theory. This report, however, was not well received by the scientific community. And as a general statement, it's fair to say it was widely considered unsound by many leading experts. Even the American Medical Association warned that the proposed diet raised the potential for harmful effects. Unfortunately, these warnings were not heeded, and politics again entered the picture.
Yep.
In his first term, Richard Nixon's government had agreed to sell millions of bushels of grain to the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, there was a particularly poor growing season, which resulted in a spike in the prices of grain. So to minimise public disquiet, the Department of Agriculture unleashed a suite of policies designed to increase grain production. And they worked. Before long, there were massive surpluses of grain. About the same time, this lady, Louise Light...
Let's go back there for a second because he didn't mention it, but you can see it right here at the bottom. Field S, the fat of the land. Do agricultural subsidies foster poor health? Subsidies. When you look at the healthcare system, when you look at the education system, and you question, why is it so expensive? Why is it so wrong so many of the times? I mean, our kids aren't being educated. People who go to the hospital aren't getting healthier. People who go see their doctors are still struggling. Cost is through the roof. One of the biggest reasons that these two entities have been so exacerbated in their wrong direction is government subsidies. And it's just that handout mentality that causes us to get trapped in a web of lies time and time again. You know, when you go around looking for ways to get money for free, you wind up paying anyway. You might get money, but money doesn't last. But these policies, they just keep going on, and then they affect your children, your grandchildren. And now we wind up in a situation where we are now, where most of the population is considered obese. People are unhealthy. They're being put on medicines that they don't need. They're being put on medicines that have side effects that are sometimes worse than what they're supposed to be treating. The doctors aren't even looking to treat the illness anymore. They're simply looking to treat the symptoms so that they can keep those paychecks rolling in. There's very few doctors out there who actually take their Hippocratic oath to do no harm seriously. And it's just we're all in one heck of a mess right now. And it's this type of thing that leads us down that path every time. I would rather not get something for nothing, because that nothing turns out to cost a whole lot more than what it would have done if you just went out there and earned it with the truth, offering value for value if you're selling something, giving people something of value for the value that they're giving you, not something that's a lie for the value that they're giving you.
All along, there were massive surpluses of grain. About the same time, this lady, Louise Light, was in charge of a team responsible for crafting the US dietary guidelines. This process, unfortunately, was informed both by the unsound science within the dietary goals, that came from the select committee and her masters within the USDA. It seems as though the new dietary guidelines were seen as a vehicle by those within the USDA to deal with their problem of the grain surplus. Consistent with Ansel Keys' fear of saturated fat, Light's team initially recommended to their masters within the USDA that there be a recommended daily intake of 3 to 4 servings of whole grain breads and cereals per day. Some, however, this recommendation for 3 to 4 serves a day, after it went through the senior bureaucrats within the USDA, increased to an extraordinary 6 to 11 serves. An effective means to address the grain surplus, no doubt, but at what cost to public health? One thing is certain, the introduction of these dietary guidelines.
What's sad regarding her too is that she was not really completely on board with this whole idea, but she was recommending some of the things that Ansel Keys and these other studies had been able to develop. But she also found that eating meat wasn't as bad as people were saying, that eating saturated fat wasn't as bad, and there was a recommendation for a higher amount of that. They had recommendations for fresh vegetables and fresh fruits that she was recommending, that the study, the people that were behind this, not the study, but the commission that were putting these guidelines together, reduced the amounts of the meats and fruits and vegetables. Now, as a carnivore, people will ask, well, what do you care about the fruits and vegetables? The biggest reason why I don't eat fruits and vegetables today is that they are frankenfood compared to what they were even in the 1970s. Between genetic modification, all the chemicals that we spray on the plants to either keep pests away or to kill them for harvesting, like they use glyphosate or glyphosate, whatever they call Roundup, to kill wheat and oats before it's harvested because it makes it easier to harvest. And then they supposedly wash it off. But if you think it's getting all that poison off of that food that you wind up eating when you eat a bowl of cereal or eating bread or any of the other things, you're drinking your oat milk or any of that other stuff that sounds like it's healthy because everybody's been saying it's healthy, you're getting that poison along with it. You're getting those genetically modified organisms that are designed to help the plants be more pest resistant. Well, that translates into higher toxicity for the plant material. That's the plant's defense mechanism. And that's what causes a lot of the problems, like the problem that I was having that got me started on this way of eating was gut pain that doctors could not explain. Gut pain that was making me literally go crazy with not only the pain, but dealing with doctors looking at me like I was insane, acting like I was just seeking pain medicine or something like that, something I'm gladly free from now. And it was causing difficulties in my personal life. It was causing me to have an attitude that would be very hard to live with my wife. And it almost cost me my marriage. But being able to get away from all of these poisons, and including vegetables and fruits, like they also crossbreed fruits to make them more sweet. I remember a time when the delicious red apple was the most sweet apple you could buy. But then, since then, they've come up with these hybrid fruits of apples that are like the Fiji apple or Fuji apple. I forget which one it is. And then they have the Honey Crisp, which used to be one of my favorites before I started eating this way because it was the sweetest apple. It was so sweet, it was unnaturally sweet. And now when people try a Red Delicious apple, they go, oh, this doesn't have hardly any flavor, because we are so addicted to what we have done to our food that we don't even know what natural food tastes like. Also, there was a time when fruits and vegetables were harvested during a certain season and were only available during certain seasons. Now, everything's available year-round. They ship it from around the world. You get stuff that's not appropriate for the area that you live in, that would make it appropriate for the human diet living in that area. You get foods that are sprayed with chemicals designed to either keep them ripe while they're in transit or to ripen them while they're in transit, or to prevent them from over-ripening while they're in transit. And all of this stuff, they say, well, it's generally recognized as safe at the FDA until you find out years later that you've got a health epidemic on your hands. And by then, nobody knows what to do. They come up with new solutions, just like they're talking about here. These new solutions that were supposed to help us with the heart problems have led to exacerbated diabetes problem, exacerbated mental health problems. Alzheimer's these days is being referred to as diabetes type 3 because they're finding out now that it is related to the effects of getting late onset diabetes. And all of this stems from the food we've been eating since the turn of the 20th century. And I don't know if he's going to point it out here. It looks like he's talking about number of people diagnosed with diabetes right here. And you can see starting in the late 90s, we had a tremendous increase. Well, I don't know if he's going to get into it, but there were some changes to our guidelines around the 1990s period, or actually the 1980s period, that really not only started to show the increase in diabetes, but early in the 80s, right around 1980, you see a steep incline of obesity, all coming from these food guidelines.
One thing is certain, the introduction of these dietary guidelines in 1980 coincided with a steady increase in the diabetes epidemic. Nowadays, in fact, only 12% of US adults can be considered metabolically healthy. Clearly, something's gone wrong.
12%.
Unfortunately, for us here down under, after these new dietary guidelines took hold in the US, the rest of the world began to get infected, beginning with Australia. This man, Professor Stuart Truswell, originally from South Africa, was at the time the chair of human nutrition at the Sydney University. He took it upon himself to develop dietary goals for Australians based on the 1977 US dietary goals. The problem was that Professor Truswell was somewhat unique amongst his colleagues in that he was a vocal supporter of the US dietary goals. In his own words, he provided a rare, positive, independent review against what he called a host of critics, and so the stage was set. Already being a firm believer in the US guidelines, again by his own admission, he didn't perform his own review of the literature. Essentially, he regurgitated the US dietary goals, which he had already glowingly endorsed.
And I think something he's leaving out here is the fact that researchers were not getting published when they did studies that countered what Ansel Keys's predictions models had made. So if you wanted to be in the in crowd, you did exactly what that guy just did. You follow the main narrative. You follow the narrative that's going to get you government funding, that's going to get you funding from the companies that want to support this type of information, this propaganda being spread. And if you didn't want to get, if you wanted to just do science, well, you're going to have to find your own money. You're going to have to find your own way down the path. And thank God for the ones who did stick with the truth. Even though, as far as popular knowledge is concerned, they fall into the wayside, we still have doctors like Paul Mason here that dig this stuff up, and other researchers who are able to come forth and say, look, here are the studies that they did that they ignored. They ignored the truth because they had a narrative they wanted to push. And now that narrative has got us all sick, fat, and unhappy.
It was not, it's fair to say, an independent process. The fact is, if he had reviewed the literature at the time, he would have discovered that even then in 1977, there was an abundance of evidence against the notion of reducing dietary saturated fat.
That doesn't mean he would have used that evidence because it didn't fit what would get him published. Clearly, somebody who is supposedly a scientist or a doctor that's supposed to be in charge of healthcare for a country like this situation in Australia that doesn't look at the evidence isn't interested in the evidence. So even if he had seen the evidence, who knows if it would have been followed, because it's about obtaining power, about obtaining prestige, about obtaining wealth. It's a natural human failing, but unfortunately, if you're not willing to consider that people would do something like this, you're going to continue to allow lies to be fed to you, and then you're going to suffer the consequences, and so will your children and your grandchildren. We've got to wake up, people.
70 randomized controlled trials. Truswell literally turned a blind eye to the evidence. And following publication of the first dietary guidelines in 1980, Truswell has remained a key figure in the following editions. which continue to discourage the intake of saturated fat. The obvious reason that our current guidelines, the 2013 edition, continues to avoid the science is an open admission by the panel that they deliberately ignored it. In the public consultation report, in response to a member of the public asking them to review the evidence on saturated fat, they responded that the request to review the evidence was not supported by evidence. Now, this makes my head hurt. There's not enough evidence to justify looking at the evidence. It would be a joke if the consequences weren't so serious.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the document from which I found this information, which was about 8 years ago, seems to have now disappeared from the internet. Have no doubt that the dietary guidelines are hugely impactful. The principles are taught in schools, every childcare centre across the nation. They also guide, some would say direct, the food we feed to patients, prisoners and soldiers. Check out the reduction in fat intake in Australia since the late 1970s. The problem is it doesn't seem to be working. Just like the US, Australia has seen an almost inexplicable rise in diabetes. This is a graph of the prevalence of type 2 diabetes in Australia in 2020. The question is, how can we ensure that the guidelines, future guidelines, consider the science? There certainly seems to be a change of heart in some quarters. I'd like to introduce you to two experts who appear to have changed their minds. This is Professor Janet King, the chair of the 2005 Scientific Dietary Advisory Committee, which developed the 2005 iteration of the US dietary guidelines. And this is Professor Tom Brenner, a member of the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. And what they have in common is that they were both authors on this 2020 review paper, concluding that government limits on saturated fat are not justified by the science. The paper specifically refers to the fact that dairy, meat and eggs are not associated with an increased risk of heart disease and should not be limited. It also makes the point that saturated fats are an ancient food, no doubt in an attempt to highlight the paradox in blaming them for modern disease.
That's something I have clearly experienced. For those of you who are unfamiliar with my diet, I eat a ribeye or two, at least 2 pounds roughly every day on average, and sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. Sometimes I fast. Like right now, I've been fasting over the past 6 weeks for 3 days a week, feasting 4 days, fasting 3 days. You know, I'm going through a little different experiment here, but generally on my diet, I have just eaten a lot of ribeye steak, a good bit of hamburger, a lot of other cuts of meat. I buy whole cows, and all I eat almost on a 100% basis, not 100%, but close to it, is beef. The one thing that we were told for years when I was growing up, stay away from it. It's going to cause heart disease and cancer and all these other problems. And yet, over the past 3 years, it has brought me the best health, the best mental clarity, the best strength, the best of everything that I have been looking for in my life when I wanted to have a healthy body and a healthy mind, all the way back from when I was young, struggling with weight problems and trying to figure out why I had to choke down salads all the time, only to continually face obesity issues, and then later on have my gallbladder removed, have other problems that I was having with my back from having all this extra weight, later having these gut issues, GERD issues, high blood pressure. All of it is gone. All of it is gone. I'm 51 years old. I've been eating meat for 3 years, and all of it is gone. I feel better than I have in my whole life. And if I was following these rules that they put down for us, these suggestions that we stay away from them, I might not be alive today. I truly believe that, because if I hadn't died from what was causing me these issues, I might have wanted to take my own life, because it was miserable living that way. And I know there are people watching this right now who are living in that same misery, who don't know what's going on or why when they try to do the right thing, all these bad things are happening. You've got to listen to what people like this are willing to tell you about the truth that has been kept from you about how you can live a healthy and happy life. I encourage you, if you've never seen a video about carnivore eating, go back and watch my very first video, 125 Days on Lion Diet. It'll take you through what was for me an experiment that I was trying for 6 weeks that turned into something I've been doing now for 3 years, and it has literally changed everything, and it might be able to change everything for you if you're willing to give it a look and then possibly give it a try.
And so, ought we be more optimistic for the next iteration of the Australian Dietary Guidelines, given that a review is currently underway? This here is my good friend, Dr. James Mukey, Health Campaigner and Australian of the Year in 2020. And he's had concerns about the adverse health impacts of the dietary guidelines for some time, which is why he was thrilled when the Federal Health Minister at the time, Greg Hunt, publicly committed in 2021 at the conclusion of James' televised National Press Club address to allow James to be a part of the scientific review process for the next iteration of the Australian Dietary Guidelines. Somehow though, even a public commitment from the Federal Health Minister wasn't enough. And so our guidelines are currently under development somewhere out of public view.
And this is the kind of thing that you hear that fosters what people call conspiracy theories. You know, those things that we keep finding out actually were the truth a couple of years before we all realized it's the truth. When you hear things like that, when you have people who are questioning the evidence and looking at it and saying, this doesn't point to what we said it points to, it points to the opposite, and then all of a sudden it goes behind closed doors again, and then we get more of the same, that's where people start to say, why are they doing this to us? Why are they wanting to keep us sick and fat and unhappy and unhealthy and in brain fog and unable to fight back and unable to resist when things are being put upon us by those in power who just want more power? I wonder why.
I'm unfortunately borderline pessimistic about what the outcome's going to be. There is, however, a glimmer of hope. There is currently a Commonwealth inquiry into diabetes, largely as a result of lobbying by James. There are several previous medical doctors in Parliament who are sitting on this inquiry, and that presents a major opportunity. Submissions which have already been made are all accessible. My personal one, if you go to this website, being number 402. And if you feel passionate about this issue, if you've got a personal story to tell, please reach out to the committee membership, whose details are available on the website. If possible, meet with them. Tell them your story, if you have one. Discuss the science. Through the actions of the very brave 2020 Australian of the Year, James Mukey, we've got a sliver of opportunity. And together, we might just be able to take it. Thank you.
Well, let's see. How old was this video? I don't know. Let me see when it came out. 1 month ago. So this is fairly recent, guys. You guys that are, guys and gals, that are down under, that live in Australia, who wish to see some truth come to your healthcare system, some truth in your government, follow that advice. Check into the things that he was just talking about there, because I'm sure as an American, my voice isn't going to carry too much down there with the government officials and the doctors that are down there. But I know there's a lot of you guys who have had a tremendous benefit from a carnivore way of eating. I've spoken to some of you on my channel, and I've had you on the show, and I know that there are more. I know there are a lot more, because the Australian people, just like the American people, are a very rugged group. They're tough-minded, and they're independent, and they're willing to take a stand for the things that are right. So go check that out and see if you can't help get your voice heard so that people can learn the truth. And in addition to doing that, you can share this video, as I mentioned before. You can share directly the video that Dr. Paul Mason just did here. I'll have the links in the description. I have a link to another video that's a bit more exciting in its presentation that was made by, let me see who it was, the Food Evil Group or something like that. Let me do Food Pyramid. Literally a Scam, I think was the name of it. Yes, Evil Food Supply is the name of the channel. I'll put their channel link in the description. They've got 28 other videos that seem to have a lot of good information. I haven't watched the other videos yet, but they're all along the same lines of presenting the things that we have been told about food in a way that's quite digestible for people who are used to the glitz and glamour of Hollywood production and TV shows that put a lot of production value. You know, this was more of a classroom setting, so who you share it with might look at it and be like, I ain't got time to watch some guy drone on and show me slides. The Evil Food Supply channel has this video called The Food Pyramid is Literally a Scam, and he breaks a lot of this same stuff down. He goes into some stuff that Dr. Mason didn't talk about, which is good. So I would encourage you to watch it even just for your own knowledge, so you can understand when your family comes to you and says, are you sure you should be doing this? This is not healthy. I know this is not healthy. This is going to cause cancer. This is going to cause heart disease. And then when you go and you see all these different carnivore influencers who are on YouTube, just like me, telling our story about how we've gotten healthier as a result of this, and that it's changed our lives, and then it's changed the lives of people that we've spoken to, you'll be able to have some ammunition that not only goes along with what they call anecdotal evidence of me having this experience and somebody else having this experience, but you also have the official evidence, the actual evidence, scientific evidence that we have been lied to about what we're supposed to be eating. And then if that doesn't open the door for somebody to consider, well, if we were lied to about this, then maybe it's worth looking at some other options. And then when you start to see the amazing number of anecdotal evidence that's out there with person after person going carnivore and getting their life back, even people who used to be vegan and vegetarian finding that not only were they able to get healthier as a result of a carnivore way of eating, but they also find out that this is actually better for animals too than the agribusiness that spends all this money on pests and getting rid of rodents and getting rid of birds and getting rid of all the other things that try to eat their food, because there's far more animals dying in the growing of plants and fruits and vegetables than there are in the growing of animals for eating. As a matter of fact, it supports the animal population when we are spending time getting these animals fed, getting these animals happy, even though not all the production is done the way it should be. That's a video for another time. And I got some videos talking about how there's farmers out there who raise their animals humanely, regeneratively. They don't use a lot of chemicals and poisons on their field or the animals. So it can be done. It's just going to take a groundswell of people who are demanding good quality food, good quality meat. And if you're going to stick with vegetables, demand stuff that hasn't been adulterated and turned into frankenfood. You know, you're going to be a lot better eating natural food than you are going to be eating all this ultra-processed garbage, all this sugar that we didn't used to have in our diet. I mean, it's so much higher than you could even imagine. I think it's like something like 4,900% higher than what we were eating 120 years ago compared to now. So if this doesn't open your eyes to something that's worth investigating, I don't know what else to tell you. I hope that it has. If it's just ammunition for you to share with other people, I hope that you'll share it. I'll be doing more videos like this, and I have videos where I share information on how I eat this way. I have been sharing my story over the past 3 years. I occasionally do live streams, so you can come and ask me questions. And be sure to leave questions in the comment section, because I try to get to all the questions I possibly can, and that way I can help more people find out how they can live the life they want to live. Of course, I'm just some guy on YouTube. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a doctor. But if my experience is worth anything to you, please let me know your questions and I'll do my best to answer them. You can also check me out on Ferrigno Freedom Facebook group and Facebook page. The Facebook group is private so that we can get together and share ideas and share successes and hopefully encourage each other down this path toward better health. And then the Facebook page is there for people who might want to be able to have a more public interaction with me and my channel. But that's all I got, guys. I'll see you next time.
If we pay extra, could we maybe get some grease or fat?
One of the things I do to fight back against big food and big pharma is to recommend companies that make animal-based products that are good for our bodies and good for our skin. In this case, I'm talking about Vintage Tradition. Vintage Tradition tallow balms are a go-to for me now, especially the unscented one. I like it because it doesn't have anything extra in it other than extra virgin olive oil and tallow rendered from suet. Highly saturated and therefore more therapeutic than any other. They don't use any trim fat or any other fats besides suet. So if you want some ancestrally appropriate skincare products that are going to help support the carnivore movement, head over to vintagetradition.com and use my discount code DANTE, D-A-N-T-E, to save 10% on your order. I promise you won't regret it. Their products are fantastic. I love them and I use them all the time.